At 78 years old, Benny Andersson has finally decided to tell his story, not the polished version the world has always seen, but the real one, led with pain, silence, and a lifetime of emotions poured into melodies rather than conversations. For decades, fans celebrated ABBA's music without fully understanding what drove it. Now, the man who built that sound from the ground up is ready to speak, and what he reveals changes everything we thought we knew about one of the most iconic bands in music history. Before ABBA conquered the world, Benny was simply a boy captivated by melodies. He grew up surrounded by Swedish classical and folk music, absorbing structure and emotional depth long before he ever touched a synthesizer. Church harmonies and the Swedish accordion shaped his musical instincts, giving him a compass that pointed not toward trends, but toward something timeless. While the world would eventually sing along to Dancing Queen and Waterloo, Benny's creative roots ran far deeper than disco lights and magazine covers. His sound came from a quieter, more personal place, and that distinction would define everything ABBA ever created. His creative partnership with Björn Ulvaeus became the engine that powered the band. Benny crafted the chords, the tension, the emotional undercurrents, while Björn shaped the lyrics and narrative. Together, they constructed songs that felt deceptively simple on the surface, but carried enormous emotional weight underneath. Benny didn't just write music, he sculpted it, spending entire days adjusting a single harmony, chasing a feeling rather than a sound. He worked until each track matched the emotion he held in his mind, not for perfection in a technical sense, but for honesty. Every song he created was a message, even when listeners couldn't fully decode its meaning. Yet for all his contributions, Benny existed largely in the background. While Agnetha Foltskog and Anna Fridlingstad stood in the spotlight, drawing cameras and headlines with their beauty and charisma, Benny watched quietly from behind the glass of the control room. He once admitted that he never truly felt seen within ABBA, not as a star, but as a craftsman. Fans screamed for the singers, but few paused to notice the man arranging every string, every echo, every carefully placed silence. He wasn't the face of the brand, but he was always its foundation. He was also the group's emotional anchor, the one who stepped in to smooth over creative tensions and manage the feelings simmering beneath the surface. That role, carried largely in silence, wore him down in ways he rarely acknowledged at the time. What made Benny's situation particularly complex was the way he processed emotion. He has since admitted in interviews that music was his therapy, his way of expressing feelings he simply couldn't face in real life. When words failed him, when confrontation felt too risky, he sat down at the piano and let the keys do the talking. This meant that many of ABBA's most moving, emotionally devastating songs were actually Benny's way of avoiding direct vulnerability. He wasn't hiding, exactly, but he wasn't fully present either. The music was a safer place to feel. Nowhere was this more apparent than in his relationship with Frida. Their bond didn't begin with romance in the traditional sense. It grew slowly through late nights in the studio, through melodies that revealed pieces of themselves before words could. Frida was open and emotionally expressive, someone who felt things loudly and needed warmth in return. Benny was quiet and internal, most comfortable behind a piano. Their differences made the music extraordinary, but they made the relationship increasingly difficult. Frida needed someone present outside the recording booth, someone who could feel without composing. Benny, by his own admission, wasn't that person. He poured his emotions into arrangements and chord progressions, then shut down when the music stopped. Songs like The Winner Takes It All and One of Us, widely regarded as some of the most emotionally powerful breakup ballads ever written, were, Benny now confesses, his way of avoiding the very conversations those songs described. The music gave him control. Real-life emotions felt too messy, too unpredictable. He has since expressed guilt over this pattern. Writing pain, he says, was always easier than owning it. Frida, meanwhile, lived every lyric she sang with the full weight of their real tension and heartbreak. She wasn't performing abstraction. For her, those songs were deeply personal. The imbalance eventually cracked the foundation of what they shared. In one of his most quietly devastating recent admissions, Benny said, he gave his best lines to songs, not to the people who needed to hear them. That confession reframes the entire emotional history of the band. Beyond his personal relationships, Benny was fighting another, less visible battle, one against perception itself. The world loved to discuss ABBA's female rivalry, debating who sang better or dressed more brilliantly. But the real, unspoken tension had nothing to do with Agnetha or Frida. It was Benny, quietly competing not with a person, but with fame's selective attention. No matter how many songs he wrote or how many hours he spent crafting the arrangements that would move millions of people to tears, his name barely made the footnotes. He was often labeled the cold brain of ABBA, smart and technical, but distant. In reality, the opposite was true. He was pouring his soul into every bar of music, expressing pain, longing, and love through each carefully chosen chord. Being misread as a machine, when he was in fact the group's most emotionally complex contributor, was a wound that never fully healed. He didn't want fame in the traditional sense. He wanted fairness. He wanted people to understand that he was more than a keyboard player standing in the back. He was the architect of a sound that carried human emotion across continents and generations. When critics dismissed ABBA's songs as catchy pop fluff, it cut Benny more deeply than anyone realized, because he knew what had gone into every layer, every carefully placed pause, every melody that seemed simple but hid something aching beneath it. He began reading reviews, hoping someone would notice the emotional structure of what he'd built. Most didn't. As the late 1970s wore on, something else was quietly fracturing: the music itself. ABBA's success seemed unstoppable from the outside, but inside the group, the creative spark was fading. Constant touring had drained them. The pressure to keep delivering hits weighed heavily. Benny recalls the exact moment he knew it was time to stop, not because of any conflict or dramatic falling out, but because the music no longer felt true. The honesty that had always driven him was gone, replaced by obligation and routine. He stayed not out of passion, but out of guilt and a deep sense of responsibility toward the others. He didn't want to let anyone down. But the creative joy that had once fueled him had quietly disappeared. The end came without ceremony. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful farewell, no group conversation where they acknowledged what was happening. It was simply a slow fade into silence, an unspoken understanding that the chapter was closing. Benny has reflected on how strange that was, how four people who had shared so much never really sat down to talk about what they were feeling as it ended. They simply drifted apart, and the music stopped. Frida had already begun emotionally detaching before the official end arrived. For Benny, it took far longer. He admits it was nearly a decade before he truly processed that ABBA was over, and even then, the emotional residue lingered in ways he hadn't anticipated. He describes the band's dissolution not as scandal or drama, but as creative death, a quiet collapse that no one quite saw coming until it was already complete. In the years that followed, Benny retreated, not to escape the public, but to heal. He threw himself into theater, orchestral composition, and film scoring. Working on projects like Chess and Christina Franduvamala gave him the chance to explore emotional territory, without the machinery of pop fame pressing down on him. These weren't just new creative projects, they were a form of recovery, a way of rebuilding his identity outside the constraints of what ABBA had become. He also kept a journal during this period, filled with unsent letters addressed to his former bandmates, Frida, Agnetha, and Bjorn. In those pages, he wrote everything he had been too afraid to say during the years when the music and the tension and the pressure were at their peak. It was a raw, private exercise in confronting feelings he had spent decades composing around rather than through. In his later years, Benny has found a different kind of purpose. He began mentoring young Scandinavian composers, passing on not just technical knowledge but emotional wisdom, the kind of understanding about creative vulnerability and artistic honesty that he himself took decades to develop. He has become a thoughtful elder figure, guiding the next generation not only in the craft of composition, but in the emotional complexity of living as an artist. And now, at 78, Benny has offered the most honest assessment of all. ABBA, he says, wasn't built on joy. It was built on pain, escape, and fragile humanity. The music worked because they were broken, and it made them feel whole. They weren't a fairy tale. They were four people trying not to fall apart, and the music was the only thing holding them together. That confession, simple as it sounds, reshapes everything. It explains why their songs still carry such emotional weight decades later, why something in them reaches people across cultures and generations. The songs were never about perfection. They were about survival. The cracks, Benny admits, were there from the very beginning, papered over by collective drive and the sheer force of the music they were making together. But the music that connected them was also the thing that kept them from truly confronting themselves and each other. It was their escape route as much as their gift to the world. In the end, ABBA didn't break because of tabloids or touring or the public's expectations. It broke because the people inside it were too human, too real, and too emotionally complicated to carry the weight indefinitely. What Benny has given us now, finally and without reservation, is the full picture, not ABBA as a glossy pop phenomenon, but ABBA as a deeply human story about four fragile people who found in music the only language honest enough to hold them together. The real legacy of ABBA isn't the fame, the costumes, or even the songs themselves. It's the truth beneath them, the pain that made them beautiful, and the humanity that made them last.